Okay. Good morning, everybody. Can I have everybody's attention, please? Okay. Good morning and welcome to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on victims' rights in Burma. I would like to extend a special welcome to our witnesses, and I want to thank them for their presence today. The Commission could not do its work without the support of human rights organizations and brave individuals like you in the United States and around the world. We deeply appreciate all that you do. Burma, a multi-ethnic state, has been in the news for months for a terrible reason. Over the last 2 years, the Burmese military, Tatmadaw, has waged a brutal, scorched earth campaign against the Rohingya minority in Rakhine State. A new civilian government took power in Burma in March 2016. A few short months later, the Tatmadaw campaign displaced tens of thousands of Rohingya into Bangladesh. A second campaign began in August 2017 and has forced some 700,000 more people to flee to Bangladesh. Villages have been razed to the ground, women and girls gang raped, men executed. The whole Rohingya population has been demonized by the authorities, some Buddhist leaders, and far too many of the Burmese people. Aung San Suu Kyi, a state counselor and a once revered human rights figure, has been unable, unwilling, or both to do anything to stop the criminal violence. Criminal because it is hugely disproportionate to the assaults by an armed insurgent group used to justify it, and because the Tatmadaw targets civilians. But here's the thing. There is little that is new, except perhaps the scale and the clearance campaign perpetrated against the Rohingya in Burma. The Burmese military has used the same tactics for decades against other ethnic populations in Burma. The infamous Four Cuts counterinsurgency strategy seeks to deprive ethnic armed organizations of food, funds, intelligence, and recruits by terrorizing civilians and driving them out of their villages. The Burmese military directly attacks villages, murders unarmed civilians, rapes women and girls, sets landmines in fields and roads, and destroys crops, markets, homes, and property. A brutal campaign in Karen state during the 1980s forced tens of thousands to flee to Thailand. Over 300,000 people were driven from their homes in central Shan State between 1996 and 1998, and another 100,000 fled Kachin and northern Shan State in 2011. The Tatmadaw has never been held accountable for its abuses. In fact, Burma's 2008 constitution shields them from accountability for past crimes. And now, in 2018, in spite of a government peace initiative begun by the civilian government, fighting in Kachin and Shan states has intensified, and there are new allegations of serious human rights abuses by the military. We will hear today that the same tactics used against the Rohingya over the last 2 years have been and continue to be deployed in several of Burma's ethnic states. I believe the entrenched impunity of the Burmese military contributes to the unending cycle of violence in Burma. It is time to recognize that what has happened to the Rohingya is not an aberration. It is the modus operandi of the Burmese military, and it must end. Today we will hear recommendations for ways to advance accountability for an institution that has been out of control for far too long. I want to note that the House has acted on this issue when it approved bipartisan language for the National Defense Authorization Act to impose targeted sanctions on Burmese military officials implicated in gross human rights abuses and other atrocities against ethnic minorities. Unfortunately, that provision did not make it through the NDAA conference, so we need to find a new way forward. But accountability for past crimes is not enough. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We say that victims have rights, and one of those is the right to justice. But there are other rights as well. There's rights such as the rights to truth, to reparations, and to the guarantee of non-reoccurrence, meaning that violence will not be repeated, that it will end once and for all. The guarantee of non-reoccurrence is about prevention. So how do we stop the ongoing violence and keep it from starting up again? This is where issues like citizenship, resolving land disputes, and ensuring real civilian control over security forces come into play. This is why reforming laws and policies that lead to gross human rights violations is essential. A permanent end to the violence requires addressing the underlying sources of conflict that are tearing the country apart. And I hope that we will also hear recommendations along these lines this morning. So let me close with one more comment. The government of Burma has consistently denied that its forces have committed the crimes that you will hear about today, calling the allegations fake news. But the information the witnesses will share with you is well documented. It is credible, and it has been verified. So the Burmese government is lying, while imposing a huge humanitarian crisis on neighboring countries and the rest of the world. This is simply outrageous. No government has the right to do what Burma has done. Sovereignty does not extend to genocide, nor to ethnic cleansing, nor to the commission of any human rights abuses. Governments do not have the right to crush whole populations. We need to emphatically reiterate this message every single day to every single rogue government around the world. So let me now turn to our witnesses, who we are honored to have with us here today. Michael Martin, who's a specialist in Asian affairs with the Congressional Research Service. Gum San Sang, president of the Kachin Alliance, and Tun Kin, a Rohingya human rights activist. And so we are honored to have you all here, and we will begin with Mr. Martin, and welcome.
Chairman McGovern and Holtgren, members of the Commission, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My testimony is based on covering events in Myanmar for 10 years for CRS, as well as 3 recent trips to Burma within the last 9 months. With your permission, I'd like to submit a separate, more detailed written statement for the record.
Without objection.
In 2011, Burma's military junta, the State Peace and Development Council, or SPDC, transferred power to a mixed civilian-military government under the terms of a 2008 constitution written by the SPDC. The SPDC's former Prime Minister, General Thein Sein, was selected as president and soon implemented some promising political changes. However, after a couple of years, he seemed uninterested in or unable to make any additional political reforms. In addition, his efforts to negotiate a nationwide ceasefire agreement to end Burma's nearly 70-year-old civil war were only partially successful. In November 2015, Aung San Suu Kyi and her political party, the National League for Democracy, or NLD, won more than 80% of the elected seats in Burma's parliamentary elections. Hopes were high that the new government could make constitutional amendments and pass new laws to transform Burma into a civilian-led democracy that protected the human rights and civil liberties of all its people, as well as successfully negotiate an end to the civil war. That optimism, however, didn't fully take account the provisions of the 2008 Constitution that endowed the military with significant control over the government. Nor did the optimism sufficiently recognize the military's commitment to protect and preserve its authority and power. For example, the 2008 Constitution grants the Commander-in-Chief of Burma's security forces the power to appoint 25% of the members of both chambers of the Union Parliament. It also requires that more than 75% of all the members of the Union Parliament vote in favor of any proposed constitutional amendments. This effectively gives the Commander-in-Chief veto power over constitutional amendments. Aung San Suu Kyi soon learned that the Commander-in-Chief, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, had no interest in supporting her proposed constitutional amendments. The 2008 Constitution also grants the Commander-in-Chief final authority over all of Burma's security forces, including the military, or Tatmadaw as you referred to, the Border Guard forces, and the Myanmar Police Force. As a result, while Aung San Suu Kyi might be able to negotiate peace with the Ethnic Armed Organizations, or EAOs, Min Aung Hlaing will decide if Burma's security forces will abide by the peace agreement. Min Aung Hlaing has been, at best, lukewarm about Aung San Suu Kyi's peace process. He consistently blames the EAOs for the continuation of the civil war and criticizes their unwillingness to accept the military's terms for peace: disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, DDR as they call it, and acceptance of the existing 2008 Constitution. Meanwhile, Burma's military forces are actively fighting with EAOs in Kachin and Shan states, who have not signed the not-quite nationwide ceasefire agreement, as well as with an EAO in Karen state, who has signed the ceasefire agreement. Many of the EAOs, and I've met with many of the EAOs, signatories and non-signatories, have little or no faith in Burma's military's commitment to peace. In addition, Burma's military forces have been accused of attacking non-combatant civilians in Kachin, Rakhine, Shan, and I just read today, Chin State, as part of, as you alluded to, the four-cut strategy to deprive the EAOs of food, funds, intelligence, and recruits. You will hear from the other witnesses today about the resulting extrajudicial killings, torture, and rapes. Military officials I met with in Burma last month categorically denied their troops have committed any of these human rights abuses. However, it seems no coincidence that the 33rd and 99th Light Infantry Divisions, which led the clearance operations in Rakhine State in September 2017, are now leading the military's offensive in Kachin and Shan State. And previously, they were in Shan State. Understandably, many of the survivors of the human rights abuses in Burma demand some form of accountability for the crimes they endured. But their demands go beyond basic justice. Many of the Rohingya, many of which I've met, insist that some form of accountability process be undertaken before they will voluntarily return to Rakhine State. The same goes for many of the approximately 100,000 people displaced by fighting in Kachin and Shan State. For them, accountability is a precondition for a true and lasting peace in Burma. This ends my oral testimony. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the Commission, and I am happy to receive any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Kumsan Sang.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Holgren, member of and staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. I'm humbled to be before you today to testify as voice for the voiceless and speak for the unspeakable atrocities such as burning villages, rape, starvation, forced deportation, and murder inflicted upon thousands of Shan, Kachin, Taang population in northern Burma. Kachins are slightly over a million in number, a predominantly Christian enclave nestled at the crossroad of China, India, and Southeast Asia. Before I begin with my oral updates on the crisis in Kachin and northern Shan states, I would like to acknowledge my profound gratitude to all Kachin churches, congregation, and dioceses for housing over 130,000 internally displaced people in 165 camps, feeding them and rescuing thousands of whom were trapped in the wilderness, where they experienced constant fear and intimidation by Burmese security forces. Without their responsible benevolence, the faith of my people would be complete social disintegration and even greater human tragedy than we have already suffered. And one of them is here today from Kachin Baptist Convention, President Reverend Samson. Let me start by stating that this conflict is based on ethnic sovereignty, but is fueled by the drive to control and profit from the valuable land and natural resources of the Kachin people. The Burmese military control access to billion-dollar Pagan jade mines, and war is used as a vehicle for territorial aggrandizement and economic plunder. The military dominates the jade sector through companies its own and controls, as well as companies controlled by current and former senior military officers and their families, friends, and hidden Chinese business interests. The financial incentive fuel conflict, corruption, and widespread abuses. Today, I'm reminded of Majority Leader McConnell's statements in Congress on October 12, 2011. I quote, "I rise today, as I do on many occasions, to bring attention to the numerous challenges that face the people of Burma. Of great concern to those advocating for democracy in Burma is promoting reconciliation among the diverse group in the country, Like many ethnic groups in the country, the Kachin people of northern Burma have a distinct and long-standing heritage. Yet, they continue to be targeted by the ruling junta. Not only is the struggle against the oppressive junta of concern to those of us focused on reform in Burma, they also have an important historical connection to the United States. 7 years since this statement in 2011, there has been over 300 clashes between Kachin Independence Army and Burmese Army, averaging 46 battles per month. This is the largest military campaign in modern Burmese history since independence, with at least 411 airstrikes by jet fighters and helicopter gunship, including one in the past few days. Air assault complemented by military drones and heavy artillery shells landing in IDP camps and also on Chinese side of the border. Some sobering facts. Victims whom I have met personally and interviewed were used as human shields for weeks on end. They were deliberately targeted and injured by Burmese soldiers. These civilians will spend the rest of their days in physical disability, a sad consequence of targeted military assault. The only response by the Burmese army has been pointing fingers and blocking journalists and humanitarian organizations from entering our region, whereby the press may report findings and relief organizations may provide sustained support. We have also obtained records of Burma Army ordering newly arrived displaced people to be segregated from the local community in Danai Township. There are reports of biodata collection by Immigration Ministry on the IDPs who fled their homes in May 2018. There were burning of homes by 33rd Light Infantry Division in Njangyang Township on April 28, 2018. Over 180 churches were desecrated, damaged, or ruined during the 7 years of civil war in Kachin region. According to the government of Burma census, the Kachin population makes less than 40% of the states. However, over 92% of displaced and persecuted people are Kachin and Christians. On December 16, 2016, the Burmese army captured KIA's Gidon post, and within weeks, a Buddhist pagoda was erected, which local considered blunt force religious oppression. In April and May 2018, clearance operation in an area of Onglot, Kasong, Lainongku, and Zhangyang forced more than 7,000 civilians to abandon their homes. There were villagers who were held as hostages for prolonged periods by the Burma army in order to be used as shields. In December 2017, on Christmas Eve, the Burma army fired artillery and shells, some of which exploded near Wejai IDP camp, resulting in widespread panic and civilian injury. With little to no access to international relief aids, real estate broker pressure beleaguered IDP population to sign long-term contract to lease their abandoned land to Chinese banana growers at rock bottom price of $100 per acre per annum. This is the only brief illustration of the range and seriousness of the abuse civilians face in connection with the fighting between two armies. The Burma military bears responsibility for many atrocities across the country, and until it pays the price for its war crime and crime against humanity, it will be emboldened to continue. The United States government must act without delay to end impunity of Burmese military and address the root causes of conflict in Kachin and northern Shan State. I hope you will take the following recommendation into consideration. 1, withholding fundings for the peace process until humanitarian blockades are lifted. 2, enact targeted sanction and exercise existing authority under the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act against all senior level Burmese military commanders, including Min Aung Hlaing, who have perpetrated mass atrocities. 3rd is to designate an envoy for mediating peace in northern Burma with an explicit mandate to help address the political and economic underpinnings of the conflict. Fourth, support and fund the establishment of an investigative mechanism through the UN, which can gather evidence and bring to prepare a dossier against the most responsible for the horrific atrocity that continue to date, as well as the future establishment of an international criminal tribunal that can bring perpetrator to justice. Last but not least, funding for the civil society organizations supporting victims and survivors and working toward justice and long-term social change, inclusion, religious freedom, and freedom of speech. And I thank you for this consideration and support. We're hopeful that one day, all people of Burma, regardless of their race or religion, will have an equal opportunity to thrive and contribute to the union they also love. And I thank you for this time.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Toon Kin?
Honorable Chairman and colleagues from civil society, thank you for providing me with the opportunity to speak before the Lantos Human Rights Commission. The Rohingya people need friends in the international community today more than ever, and forums like this are a crucial opportunity to highlight the very serious issues facing our community. I appreciate the effort that has gone into bringing us all together today and for providing me with this platform. Since August 2017, when the Myanmar security forces and their proxies launched a clearance operation in Rakhine State, headlines across the world have been dominated by the horrific abuse inflicted on the Rohingya people. Thousands of Rohingya people have been killed, hundreds of villages burned to the ground, and almost 800,000 women, men, and children forced to flee into Bangladesh. There is an abundance of credible evidence that the Tamil are responsible for crime against humanity and genocide. While we in the Rohingya community, to some extent, appreciate that our suffering has finally reached the global consciousness, the events of the past year have hardly come as a surprise. For decades, the Myanmar authorities have engaged in a systematic persecution to make the lives of Rohingya in Myanmar's Rakhine State so unbearable that we have no option but to flee. The Myanmar military is trying to violently exterminate us. The only fitting way to describe this is genocide. In 1978, the Myanmar security forces launched what they call Operation Dragon King across Rakhine State. What was ostensibly an effort to identify illegal immigrants ahead of national census turned into a vicious military effort marked by widespread human rights violation against Rohingya. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced to flee into Bangladesh. Among them were my parents, who spent several months in refugee camps in Bangladesh before returning to their homes. In the early 1990s, I witnessed similar abuse myself when another military operation was launched in Rakhine State, again leading to more than 200,000 refugees fleeing into Bangladesh. The atrocities that took place in Rakhine State from August 2017 merely represent the latest chapter in a long tale of horrific abuse. It is not just the threat of violence that is a daily reality for Rohingya in Myanmar. It is also debilitating and a state-led discrimination and segregation. For Rohingya in Rakhine State, life resembles as an open prison. Every aspect of our lives is controlled as Myanmar authorities have denied us citizenship and the rights associated with it, while imposing severe restrictions on our freedom of movement. This makes it exceedingly difficult to access basic services, livelihood, and opportunities to travel to hospital or to gain an education. This is prevailing sense of hopelessness and despair among Rohingya in Rakhine State. At the time, I myself decided to flee Myanmar in 1990s when authorities barred me from attending university, simply because I was a Rohingya. This wider perspective is important to keep in mind when discussing what can be done. Accountability is crucial to breaking this cycle of abuse and to not embolden perpetrators to commit the same genocidal crimes again. Myanmar authorities have time and again shown that it is both unwilling and unable to investigate itself. For example, the most recent commission of inquiry established by Myanmar government in 2018 will without a doubt lead to no genuine accountability. Therefore, the international community, including the United States government, has a role to play in providing justice. The United States can start by persuading the UN Security Council to refer the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. Further, I urge all international states to support a special reporter Yang Healy's call for an international accountability mechanism to build on the work done by UN fact-finding mission into human rights violations in Myanmar. The United States also can apply targeted sanctions against the perpetrators responsible for attacks against Rohingya. This accountability will be important not just for Rohingya, but also communities in other ethnic areas in Myanmar, including Kachin and northern Shan states. The Temedor has, in these areas, committed war crimes and displaced tens of thousands of people with impunity. Finally, a word on the proposed repatriation process of Rohingya refugees from Bangladesh to Myanmar. This process must not begin until the safe and dignified return of Rohingyas is guaranteed. This must include addressing the root cause of the crisis, including dismantling the systematic discrimination against Rohingya. Furthermore, the repatriation plans do not explicitly address equal access to citizenship rights for Rohingya. Prior to returns, the need to amend 1982 citizenship law. It must also involve international guarantees for the protection of Rohingya inside Rakhine State, so that we are not once again left at the mercy of Myanmar security forces. The exact nature of such protection will need to be negotiated, but could involve the deployment of UN peacekeeping force. We are also deeply disappointed that Rohingya representatives have been wholly excluded from the negotiation process between various UN bodies and the governments of Bangladesh and Myanmar. Rohingya must be allowed a seat at the table to determine our own future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your testimony. Before we go to questions, I want to yield to my colleague from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Congressman. I want to commend the Lantos Human Rights Commission for sponsoring this gathering today on a very important topic, human rights in Burma. And I also want to let you know that this is the day before the end of this week of Congress being in session, and members of Congress will depart tomorrow for the month of August for district work period. So suffice it to say that there are many events happening today which calls for Congress people to be in attendance. So this event has a lot of competition. So I don't want you to think that because there are so few of us here today that this is not an important topic for us. It definitely is. And this testimony that you all are giving us today will definitely filter into the offices of the other members of Congress, and we will take these concerns to heart. And I want to thank our panelists for being here today, both on this first panel and also the next panel to come. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. And again, let me thank the panel for their testimony. As one who has been following the situation in Burma for quite some time, and there are a lot of very familiar faces in the audience here today who we have worked with on this issue. It is just horrific what is happening. It's a challenge to the conscience of the world, and it's just been frustrating because it seems that we haven't been able to come up with an effective strategy to change the reality. But it is, none of us can say enough. There aren't words to adequately describe how horrible the situation is. I want to ask a question, and all of you can respond to it, because it's a question that's been raised many, many times as we've tried to figure out what to do, and that is that some observers have expressed concern that increased international pressure on the military could lead to a coup against the civilian government and end the democratic transition in Burma. And others argue that the military would have no interest in removing the civilian government because it provides a convenient shield for the military's actions. The civilian government gets criticized for the actions taken by the military. And I just would like to get your kind of take on this. Because I think, look, obviously the blame goes on the military, but the civilian government has behaved in a way that is unbelievably frustrating as well. But I'd like to pose that question to you, all of you, and get your response. Whoever wants to go first can. Sang?
So the first is civilian government. According to the human history, no silence has helped with the victims. It's only been sided with the victimizer.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll put that at that. And with the army military, this is the best scenario that they have construct. This is part of the 7 steps of road to democracy. This is the last step, and they would not trade this position with any other position that they can have. Even coup d'état would not be as good as what they have at this time. They have this moniker of democracy, yet they are able to are able to be doing whatever they do with impunity.
I think that the narrative coup by military, this is it is a good excuse for civilian government, particularly, I should say, from Aung San Suu Kyi.
Right.
I believe this is the best time for the military enjoying, lifting of sanctions and everything. They can enjoy impunity, international community have no leverage, so for what I believe is this is come from civilian government Aung San Suu Kyi as far as what she wants to get excused because she has no willing to do anything, and we need to look at the narrative also. The Suu Kyi is no longer she is, really to have willingness or any political will to support on Rohingyas to stop this genocide against Rohingya one side, and so this is a kind of narrative that is the way come from as far as what we see.
Martin?
I want to pick up on comments from both of my colleagues on the panel. First, the use of the word narrative, I think, is critical in the case of Burma. As I often say, facts are few, truths are many, and narratives are even more common in the country. So right now in the country, surprisingly, the Tatmadaw are seen as heroes by the vast majority of the population. What they did in Rakhine State is seen as ridding the country of a problem that's been around for decades. Now, that's not a narrative here in the United States that is easy to understand, but it is when you hear. But I want to go back to Gun San's comment about the 7 steps, because I think at a certain level, this is one of the fundamental questions in framing U.S. policy and what response may be warranted that needs to be answered. There is a narrative out there in the United States that this is a country in transition towards democracy. And indeed, my testimony recounted some of those steps that would indicate movement or change. In my written testimony, I'll be going over those 7 steps, roadmap. And a very different narrative exists out there, which is we're done. This is it. There are no further changes. The Tatmadaw have no interest in additional reform or developments, and that they have the control, as I tried to explain in my oral testimony, to prevent any further changes in the governance structure of the country, any further movement towards democracy. This is the flourishing disciplined, flourishing democracy that they had envisioned. Now, I'm an economist by training. So one of the ways we look at things in economics is sort of trying to figure the trade-offs on things. So the question is, if you take the narrative that there is a transition in place and you're wrong, there is no transition in place, how will your policies influence the situation? If, on the other hand, you assume there isn't a transition going on, we are done, and nothing will change, we're at an equilibrium unless something changes it, then your policies may be different. And so I think that's at some point a question that that needs to be addressed and thought through in terms of the formulation of policy. The administration has taken one approach historically up till now, and it looks like they're continuing with that approach. Increasingly, I look at events and I wonder if the other narrative may be a more accurate portrayal, that we are in equilibrium and nothing is going to change unless some forces provoke or require that changes take place.
Well, the Tatmadaw's campaign against the Rohingya is said to be broadly popular with the majority Burma population. Is that also the case, or equally so with the campaign against the other ethnic populations? Mr. Kin?
I think this is a military using as a tool to get support from all the people of Burma, because that Rohingya is a kind of virus for the whole Rohingya, the whole people in Burma. This is the way they use it, that Rohingyas are illegal immigrants, they will take the state, and this kind of false allegation and false media, through media they work it, and so this is the way they flaming to the public, and they want to get they are getting much more support from the public because military is systematically using it, and civilian government, as far as what we have seen, and media, they are also spreading hate speech against Rohingya. So this is a good point for the military to use this issue to to attack the Rohingyas and also to get public support. And for other ethnics also, we have, for myself, as far as what we have seen, some, but Rohingya is the main for me as far as what I have seen. Thank you.
So if we look at the conflict in northern Shan and the Kachin, there's different narrative and different perspective as well. In Kokang conflict, majority of people sided with the army. It looks, we felt that way. But in the Kachin conflict, not that much animosity. However, how do soldiers in the front line feel themselves to be in the Kachin front? This has nothing has to do with patriotism or for the country, because it's more of a tribalistic nature that it's fighting each other. But the government or the state is gearing toward this proselytizing concept to the front line. So this construction of pagodas in these indigenous Kachin indigenous homeland is what we have witnessed, and that's my assessment.
In September last year, about 3 weeks after ARSA's attacks on the security outposts, I ended up in Chiang Mai meeting with a number of the EAOs, signatories and non-signatories. And I used that opportunity to ask them, how do you understand what happened in Rakhine State? And the response was mixed. Some of them adopted sort of the Tatmadaws line that, this is a natural, these were illegal immigrants that were smuggling into the country. They were trying to spread Islam like they did in Malaysia and Indonesia. A story I could explain in more detail, but I'll skip that. But the response was mixed. There were some that, on the other hand, expressed great sympathy for the Rohingya, and in fact said, we're kind of glad, we're not glad that it happened. We are, this is an opportunity for us to also talk about how this has been going on for us for 70 years, 50 years, 40 years. So to bring international attention to, we've been dealing with this at a lower level for many years. This June, I went up to Myitkyina, the capital of Kachin State. And again, I met with EAOs, but members of civil society, and asked sort of their understanding of what's going on. And I was a little bit surprised. The answer I got are we next?
Mm.
The Kachin were expressing concern that the military, having successfully cleansed Kachin State of the Rohingya, that they are now moving into Kachin State and trying to cleanse Kachin State of sympathizers to the KIA, KIO, the opposition. And if that means driving them out of Kachin State, that's fine. And that is where this current tactic of attacking villages, not necessarily KIA outposts, is particularly concerning. Is that true? No, I don't know. This is a country of narratives. But the fact that for many in Kachin, KIA, KIO members, but also civilian society, that they are concerned that they may be the next victim of ethnic cleansing in their country is a worrying turn. Finally, the other thing that's come up both in September and now is how to understand ARSA, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army. In September, most of the EAOs and most people accepted the narrative they are terrorists. Now I'm finding people are saying they may be an ethnic armed organization, a new one, that needs to be part of the peace process. So it's a country where things shift and change rather quickly. I don't know exactly where it's going to come out.
Well, based on your trip, I mean, were there other things that surprised you? I mean, did you identify changes in the dynamic on the ground that you had not anticipated?
I also was in Naypyidaw, the capital. I met with the Ministry of Defense. And I also spoke to a number of people from civil society. And several people made the same comment, and I had the same kind of feeling. This sounds like SLORC, the predecessor of the SPDC. This is a more hardline military than I've seen the last 10 years. They were almost arrogant about feeling like they have been successful in accomplishing what they wish to do. And I looked at Min Aung Hlaing's speech at the Panglong 3 conference that just ended a couple of weeks ago. And it has that same hardline attitude. He explicitly blamed the British colonialism as well as the EAOs for the continuation of the Civil War. And once again made the statement that we could end the Civil War if you just basically lay down your arms, from the EAO's perspective, concede defeat, and accept the Constitution that the SPDC wrote, and everything would be fine. And that appears to be their perspective right now.
Mr. Stang and Mr. Kin, is there a shared agenda amongst the various ethnic minority groups in terms of how to move forward? I mean, is there kind of unity in terms of what the next step should be?
I think accountability and justice, that is the most important here. We have to look at the same military what have done to deported 700,000 Rohingyas and thousands of Rohingya been killed and raped. The same military they did in Kachin, Shan and others. So if you look as a whole, ICC referral, US government should support, that is very important, and accountability and justice. Like whoever we all are victims in Burma. Collectively, we want just to see justice. We want to bring these military criminals to international criminal court, because the impunity they enjoy, that is much over. So we must stop that. So so military must, as international community, must take action to stop these atrocities against Rohingyas and other minorities. So as far as what I believe, all the ethnic people in Burma, unfortunately some of them inside, they can't speak. They want to see military international criminal court without further delay. And that strategy also, it is important international community must support, ethnic areas, IDPs, in Rohingya IDPs and also refugees, funding and others, because IDPs are really horrible situation continuously going on. And I think it is important. Civilian government, we have not seen anything so far as strong, or there are no political will. Still we have seen the Burmanization policies on top of that military ruling in Burma. So ethnic voice is important. Ethnic all together, we are collectively, we want to see justice. This is the point I can make.
In terms of ethnic group, what Burma had never had for 70 years is full-out, comprehensive and nationwide ceasefire. We've had rotational ceasefires. Kachin were model minorities in the past 2 decades when they were waging a massive campaign against the Karen. So in terms of the solidarity and the sharing, the empathy of what has happened in the Rakhine state to both Rakhine and the Rohingya community especially, is there's certainly empathy from the ethnic groups, because we have suffered the same atrocities. We don't have to go far and beyond or read news to witness that. However, Burma Army, they foster divide along ethnic and religious line, and it elevates tension, be it in against the Rakhine and the Rohingya, or also the same in northern Burma with the Kachin and other ethnic groups. So we have to be careful. So if we do a collective, if all comprehensive solidarity network or a campaign, that's something viable. But if it's selected groups of ethnic or citizenship groups, it could be exploited by the Burma Army domestically.
So this is the final question I have here. What are we doing that's working, if anything? I mean, where's the hope here? I mean, where do we? I mean, what have we done that has resulted in some positive change, if anything? I mean, and where is that pressure point? How do we? I mean, we've all asked for accountability. We've all asked to end the violence. We're trying to support, those who have fled to Bangladesh, where, I know in the commission we've issued a gazillion statements, and we have, met with Aung San Suu Kyi when she has come here. We have raised these issues time and time again. What is it? What is it that we're not doing that we should be doing? Is there anything that we have done that has produced anything that has resulted in something positive?
So it's obvious that Burmese military do respond to pressure. That's given, and they do respond to, they want economic sanction lifted. We know that. So the first thing that we could do is, at least, I think there are 7 individuals that's still pending to be listed under Global Magnitsky Act. Hopefully we can start with that first. And justice is the only enabler of peace, and from prism of justice, and if we push that hard with a multilateral approach, it will certainly, there is hope for that. And with the civilian government, quasi-democracy, they will respond.
I think, yes, this is important. We have to look. For Rohingya crisis, as you have seen, is almost 1 year on. still, you know, like U.S. government and UK and France, we have not seen in Security Council they are referring Burma to ICC. It is very important point we need to look at. I mean, of course, sanctions and others, military, they quite worry on ICC, and also we have not seen a strong practical action so far. Also, civilian government, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi is quite, you know, she is with the military as far as what we can see. So we have not seen too much pressure to her as far as what we believe, and it is important to pressure NLD government because, you know, of course, rapes, killed, and murdered many Rohingya children, women, and men in Rakhine State. That is true. But same time, civilian government, NLD government is taking totally complicit genocide against Rohingya because her government, her minister now forcing Rohingyas to take NVC, National Verification Card. For example, what is happening like last few days ago. This is you know, this NVC card is legalizing you are a foreigner from you illegally entered from Bangladesh, or this is the way they are systematically they're doing that. This is immigration minister from NLD government. And also, you know, education for the Rohingyas, they can't study, they can't go to university. This is doing by NLD government. So systematically here they ignore, they don't care, and because it's a lack of action. As a Rohingya myself, as a victims, you know, I feel very disappointed, but we really need, you can see the victims today, we receive a lot of videos, flooded, and people are getting disease. And how far we need to wait for stronger action? This is very important, you know. How many thousands of Rohingya need to be killed, forced to take action to stop this? This is, so it is important that NLD government, we must put much pressure, and Suu Kyi is totally, I think, she has no willingness. So we can't see she is a big hope for Burma, for the Rohingyas and others in Burma. This is also important. We need to take a note. Thank you.
Martin, you have the last word.
Well, my first comment is we should be cognizant of the limits of U.S. influence in the country. It is complex, and there are other actors involved. I go back to the early days when I picked up this portfolio 11 years ago, and anytime I met with an official from the Tatmadaw or the government, back then they were the same, the first question they asked me was, what do we need to do to get rid of the sanctions? Now, you have to be careful on how you interpret things, but it seemed that sanctions was first and foremost on their mind, and it seemed to be in a mechanism that had some influence over the military. So the question would then become, in this situation, what may be the appropriate sanctions or restrictions to impose? And bear in mind, most of the laws are still on the books. It's under executive order that they are not currently being enforced. But you asked about things that may be effective. The U.S. government has been working quite extensively with civil society in Burma, Myanmar. And I've been impressed by people like the two gentlemen on the panel with me, others that I've met in the country, some who are sitting behind me, who, despite all the conditions under which they operate, they're willing to continue the struggle that they support: democracy, respect of human rights, respect of civil liberties. So sometimes in very difficult situations, and I'll particularly commend the media, the press, some members of the press, who right now are facing particularly greater pressure not to publish articles that the Tatmadaw would not like to see. There's even a law that allows them to basically sue them for defamation if they print an article that the Tatmadaw see as a negative comment on them. So working with civil society seems to be creating an environment whereby domestic pressure for change is being built up. The other aspect is I had the opportunity last month to meet with about 30 or 40 members of the Union Parliament. Now, the Union Parliament in Naypyidaw, they don't have offices, they don't have staff, they don't have workspace, they have virtually nothing to support them. And I was impressed by how many of them really do want to represent their constituents back home. If you sat down and talked with them, you'd have very common interests and concerns that were being expressed. So I think some of the work that the United States has supported working with Union Parliament, an institution that may someday give rise to a truly representative parliament, is an area where I see some progress has been made.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for your testimony. As I said at the beginning, every report that we get on what's happening in Burma continues to shock our conscience. I mean, there's a special place in hell for those who have perpetrated these atrocities against so many civilians, and I just appreciate your testimony, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in the weeks and months ahead. So thank you. I'm going to now call panel 2. Sky Wheeler, a researcher, Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Matthew Smith, Chief Executive Officer of Fortify Rights. Francisco Ben Cosme, Asia Pacific Advocacy Manager of Amnesty International USA. And Daniel Sullivan, Senior Advisor for Human Rights Refugees International. And I will say this to the previous panel and to this panel, that you have great, extensive biographies that are all going to be part of the record. But they're so extensive that if I read them all, we have no time. So. Wheeler, why don't we begin with you? Just make sure your mic is on. And maybe just before we, my co-chair, do you have an opening statement you would like to? Okay, yeah, before we begin, Mr. Hultgren will give his statement.
Thank you. So grateful for my great co-chairman, Jim McGovern, and great friend. Thank you all. And I would echo so much of what he said of our horrible plight that we see and concern and desire to do something. And so grateful for all of you being here. And just know that, again, there's nothing more important that we could be talking about than protecting the victims that we've seen suffer in Burma over the last several years, in particular, beginning in October of 2016. The world has watched in horror as the Burmese government has committed crimes of ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya population. We're now all too familiar with the images of hundreds of thousands of people fleeing from their burned out homes as they seek to escape the mass killings and systematic rape perpetrated by the Burmese security forces. Satellite footage shows that entire Rohingya villages and communities have been erased from the face of the earth. At least 690,000 Rohingya, half of whom are children, now dwell along the borders of Bangladesh, homeless and living in very difficult conditions and unable to safely return to their communities. The Burmese government continues to deny that they have had any role in perpetrating these terrible crimes, and yet this kind of repression is in line with the experience of Burma's other ethnic minorities across the country. In addition to the Rakhine state, there's also 6 other ethnic states in Burma whose minority communities have experienced targeted human rights abuses. And my staff have recently met with multiple survivors and refugees from Kachin, Kayin, Cheyenne states, the Shan states, who have shared personal stories about how the Tatmadaw attacked the villages, destroyed their crops, mined their roads, and killed their unarmed family members. Burmese government shows no discretion in perpetrating these crimes. It does not matter if you're Christian or Muslim, Karen or Kachin. If violence begins to decrease in one state, it becomes the military. It is because the military has shifted its focus and is increasing violence in another state. Today's hearing is important because victims of serious human rights abuses have the right to pursue justice for the crimes committed against them. This violence will only cease when impunity is no longer tolerated and when perpetrators are held accountable for their actions. This will serve not only the best interest of the Rohingya, but also every other ethnic minority that has been violently targeted in the country. Again, I look forward to hearing from the esteemed witnesses and want to thank you for your work and want to hear what we in Congress can be doing along with you to make sure that the reality of protection of human rights of these victims is recognized and that the abuses in Burma stop. So with that, thank you, Co-Chairman.
Thank
and I
you
yield
very
back.
much, and we now turn to Ms. Wheeler.
Thank you. Hello. Co-Chairman, Representatives McGovern and Holtgreen, thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing on human rights and the use of sexual violence by the Burmese military against ethnic minorities in Burma. Human Rights Watch has conducted research on the human rights situation in Burma for more than 25 years. We have frequently documented the systematic use of rape and other sexual violence by the Tatmadaw or Burmese armed forces, not just in the most recent violence against the Rohingya, but also against other ethnic groups. In our interviews with victims, we have witnessed their pain, shame, and distress, injuries that have corroded their personal sense of self, as well as the strength of their communities. Widespread sexual violence perpetrated by Burmese soldiers has been a hallmark of the culture of abuse and impunity in Burma's decades-long civil wars with its ethnic groups. Despite promises made during the country's democratic transition since 2011, the Tatmadaw continues to shield its soldiers from prosecution for crimes committed in military operations, including in Kachin, Shan, and Rakhine states. We have also documented repeatedly how the authorities have, through intimidation and flat denial, stopped efforts by groups and individuals, including brave women, to achieve justice for survivors for rape or end abusive practices of gang rape and the fear of rape and shame that spreads across communities. In September and October 2017, I spent 2 weeks in Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. I interviewed 52 Rohingya women and girls, including 29 survivors of rape, who had fled to Bangladesh to escape the Burmese military's campaign of ethnic cleansing that began on August 25, 2017. The rape survivors I spoke to were from 19 different villages. In every case described to Human Rights Watch, the perpetrators were uniformed members of security forces. All but one of the rapes reported to Human Rights Watch were gang rapes involving 2 or more perpetrators, but usually larger groups of soldiers who also sometimes stripped, beat, bit, laughed at, and taunted their victims. Women described soldiers in boots kicking them and beating them with rifles. In 8 cases, women and girls reported being raped by 5 or more soldiers. 15-year-old Hala Sadak from Mungdao Township said the large areas of scarring that she showed me on her right leg and knee were from where soldiers had stripped her naked and then dragged her from her home against the ground to a nearby tree where she was tied, and then she estimates around 10 men raped her from behind. Human Rights Watch documented 6 cases where Burmese military units committed mass rape on villagers, such as in Tulatoli village, where survivors said that soldiers gathered women and girls together in groups and then gang raped them or raped them, sometimes then locking them in their shelters and set them on fire. Burmese security forces raped and sexually assaulted women and girls both during the abusive clearance operations that began in August 2017, but also in the weeks prior to these major attacks, sometimes after repeated harassment. Rohingya women and girls told Human Rights Watch that they had been afraid of rape for many months prior to these events and had often experienced sexual harassment and assault from security forces and civilians aligned with those forces as part of their everyday lives. As with other survivors of Tatmadaw rape over the decades, Rohingya rape survivors spoke of enduring numerous abuses at once. In addition to being raped, women described with great distress seeing security forces murder their young children or elderly parents. Many reported witnessing cruelty towards those who are especially vulnerable, such as a soldier killing a 5-year-old girl who could not keep pace with her family by smashing her skull with the butt of his gun, or security forces pushing older people who could not flee back into burning houses. I spoke to 2 women who were forced to choose which child to save. One rape victim had to leave one baby behind in a burning house. Shocking, but none of this should have surprised us. In late 2016 and early 2017, before the August attacks began, we had already been documenting the role of sexual violence in the military's Rakhine State operations. We'd already documented 28 cases of rape and other sexual assault by the Burmese military and border guards, some of which involved several victims. In the rain-drenched Bangladesh refugee camps, I interviewed 2 Rohingya women who had been raped twice by soldiers, one in early 2017 and then again as operations intensified in August of the same year. Anyone in this room who has heard a survivor describe a rape endured will know how terrible each individual story is. But we have been hearing about military rape of women from Burma's ethnic minorities for years. The absence of any accountability for such atrocities enables it to continue. In 2011, Kachin civilians described to Human Rights Watch how Burmese soldiers attacked Kachin villages, razed homes, pillaged properties, and forced the displacement of tens of thousands of people. My colleagues documented mass rape by soldiers as well as the gang rape of individuals and collected other reporting by some brave partner organizations. This was far from the first time, however, that Human Rights Watch had interviewed Kachin survivors of rape. In 1994, we also interviewed survivors who had fled the army's burning of their villages, mass displacement, forced labor, and killings in the 1970s, the 1980s, and in the 1990s. In 2005, we documented the violations of international human rights and humanitarian law in Karen State, which runs along Thailand's border. Our partner, the Karen Women's Organization, documented 125 cases of sexual violence by military troops, half committed by high-ranking military officers. 40% of the cases were gang rapes, and in 28% women were raped and then killed. The Women's League of Burma reported rapes and gang rapes in 2003 and 2004 in all provinces with significant ethnic minority populations. The report implicated senior and junior military personnel as being perpetrators, complicit in the majority of documented rapes. The women's organization subsequently reported intimidation of survivors and witnesses. In the 1990s, we documented ongoing rights abuses and repression by the Tatmadaw in Burma's West Chin state, which borders India. Again, the pall of fear pulled over communities lasted much longer and affected many more than just the survivors of rape. At the time, Chin women and girls told us how they lived in fear of rape and other forms of sexual violence by Tatmadaw soldiers. As the financial year 2019 bill continues to move, the United States Congress should help ensure that women, including survivors, have a political voice, and together with allies such as the United Nations, should design long-term programs to assist survivors, in contrast to the Trump administration's determination to cut aid. What Ton Kin, my colleague, said earlier about how the Rohingya have not been allowed to have a seat at the table is very true. This is even more true of Rohingya women. Earlier this week, despite significant bipartisan support in both houses of Congress, the Defense Authorization Bill conferees failed to include language in the final bill that would have authorized targeted, appropriate measures against key individuals who bear responsibility for atrocities. This body, the House of Representatives, voted overwhelmingly to bar U.S. assistance or cooperation with Burma's military until those responsible for human rights crimes committed in Rakhine State and elsewhere were held accountable. Disappointingly, the Senate did not concur. But even without this law, the administration still has a number of options to impose targeted sanctions, and it should waste no time in doing so. We understand the Treasury Department continues to delay the imposition of sanctions on a list provided by the State Department for unclear reasons. Last December, the Trump administration sanctioned one individual, the Burmese Army's former chief of Western Command, for his role. There are many more individuals who should be sanctioned for their roles in atrocity crimes in Rakhine State, including those currently under consideration by the Treasury. For its part, Congress will now have to pressure the administration in other ways, including by ensuring that sexual and gender-based violence is included in discussions about possible individuals to sanction. As you know, the administration is conducting an extensive investigation into the crimes against the Rohingya, documenting allegations of murder, rape, torture, and other offenses that could, down the road, be used to prosecute members of Burma's military. At a recent Senate hearing, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo committed publicly to releasing these findings. This is particularly important as the military continues to deny that atrocities occurred. We hope the release of this report will trigger an adequate response, including increased bilateral engagement from the State Department and USAID to assist Rohingya refugees, and more diplomatic pressure on the UN Security Council to move the dial on accountability. The US government, which has contributed significant development aid to Burma throughout its democratic transition, should make it explicitly clear that unchecked sexual violence and other abuses by the Burmese military are unacceptable, and that the absence of any steps towards accountability has impaired what was until recently a growing US-Burma relationship. To that end, this Congress should ensure, particularly as the FY19 appropriations process continues to move forward, that there are adequate funds to support the health needs, both physical and psychosocial, of the women and girls impacted by Burmese military violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Smith?
Chairman McGovern, Chairman Holgren, distinguished members of the Commission, thank you very much for organizing this hearing and for the opportunity to testify today. Our team at Fortify Rights has documented the Myanmar military's crimes and impunity throughout the country for several years, including in Kachin and Shan states, where war crimes have been a particular fixture in the last 8 years. With regard to the situation in Rakhine State, up to last week, the dominant narrative was that Rohingya militants attacked dozens of police outposts on August 25th, 2017, instigating a spontaneous Myanmar army-led crackdown against Rohingya civilians, forcing the displacement of hundreds of thousands to Bangladesh. On July 19th, Fortify Rights published this 160-page report. The report details how the Myanmar authorities made extensive and systematic preparations for attacks against Rohingya civilians during the weeks and months before militants attacked on August 25th. Specifically, we found that the Myanmar authorities, 1, systematically collected sharp or blunt objects from Rohingya civilians, effectively disarming them. 2, trained and armed local non-Rohingya ethnic citizens in northern Rakhine State, preparing them for violence with swords, firearms, and in some cases through quasi-military training. 3, systematically tore down fencing and other structures around Rohingya homes, providing attackers with a greater line of sight on Rohingya civilians. 4, evicted aid groups and deprived Rohingya civilians of food and other life-saving aid, systematically weakening the civilian population ahead of attacks. 5, deployed unnecessarily high numbers of state security forces to northern Rakhine State. And 6, committed other human rights violations against civilians, including imposing discriminatory Muslim-only curfews. These deliberate actions fit within the UN framework for analysis of atrocity crimes as, quote, preparatory actions for genocide and crimes against humanity. Perhaps more importantly, international case law has considered preparations such as these as components in evaluating genocidal intent. Our investigation found that the attacks included the involvement of at least 27 Myanmar Army battalions, comprising up to 11,000 soldiers, and at least 3 additional combat police battalions, comprising an additional 900 personnel. I just want to emphasize these are conservative estimates based on information from state security forces. This report is based on a 21-month-long investigation. We did 254 interviews with Rohingya eyewitnesses and survivors. We also spoke to military and police officials in Myanmar, as well as in Bangladesh and others. It documents, as you remarked in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, how Myanmar Army soldiers, police, and other local non-Rohingya citizens hacked civilians, slit throats, fatally shot and burned thousands of Rohingya men, women, and children in a matter of weeks. Soldiers raped masses of Rohingya women and girls, killed infant children, arbitrarily arrested men and boys, and destroyed several hundred villages in arson attacks, forcing more than 700,000 civilians to flee to Bangladesh. We also documented human rights abuses by ARSA, the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, including the murder of Rohingya civilians. And members of ARSA told Fortify Rights that Atta Ullah, the head of the group, issued the kill orders. We were able to speak with several members of ARSA for this report. In light of the evidence collected, we believe there are reasonable grounds to conclude that the crimes perpetrated against Rohingya by the Myanmar Army, police, and others constitute genocide and crimes against humanity. In addition, we identify 22 military and police officials whom we believe should be criminally investigated and potentially prosecuted for genocide and crimes against humanity. As we've heard today, the military has committed these types of crimes for decades and throughout the country, not just in Rakhine State, not just against the Rohingya population. For several years, Fortify Rights has documented extrajudicial killings, rape, forced labor, widespread and systematic torture, and other human rights violations by the Myanmar Army in Kachin State and northern Shan State. And we've documented violations in these areas that we believe constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. In 2014, we exposed the systematic use of torture against Kachin civilians by the Myanmar Army, police force, and military intelligence. Those violations were committed with complete impunity. We're asking the Trump administration to do everything in its power to persuade the UN Security Council to refer the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. The prospect of a China veto at the Security Council is often used to justify inaction towards international justice. We don't subscribe to the idea that there is nothing the U.S. government and others can do to get China to step aside and allow an ICC referral to happen. We're also asking the administration to apply targeted sanctions through the Global Magnitsky Act against Myanmar Army and police perpetrators responsible for these attacks against Rohingya. The administration could begin with the 22 Army and police officials that are named in the Fortify Rights report. Lastly, as my colleague Sky Wheeler said, the administration has undertaken a comprehensive investigation into crimes perpetrated against the Rohingya in Myanmar. And this includes information that could potentially be used for future prosecutions. We do hope the administration will fulfill its commitment to publicize its findings, and we encourage accurate legal determinations. And this would potentially include a possible determination that there are reasonable grounds to conclude that the crimes perpetrated against the Rohingya constitute genocide. Publicizing the findings and conclusions of the investigation will not only serve to clarify the details of the atrocities, but it may also have a preventative effect, discouraging Myanmar Army generals from ordering further attacks on civilians. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ben Cosme. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Am I?
Ben Cosme.
Ben Cosme. So close.
Yeah, that's
right. All
right.
right. All
Yeah.
right. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for being here.
Co-Chairman, thank you for inviting me to testify on this important topic. It's been almost 1 year since the Myanmar military embarked on a devastating and lethal campaign of violence against the Rohingya population, and the world watched in horror as hundreds of thousands of Rohingya began arriving in Bangladesh, bringing with them horrific accounts of violence at the hands of the Myanmar security forces. These atrocities occurred across several hundred villages, and while the precise death toll may never be known, it is estimated that at least 6,700 Rohingya were killed in the first month alone, including at least 730 children under the age of 5. Amnesty International has documented that at least 9 of the 11 types of crimes against humanity took place during these attacks. While this campaign of violence may have been unprecedented in scope and scale, it is not the first time the Rohingya community has been subjected to such widespread and systematic abuse and forced expulsion. Our organization has for decades documented wide-ranging violations against ethnic minorities in the country. We have documented state-sponsored violence in places like Kachin and Shan State, which include extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearance, arbitrary detentions, torture, and forced labor. Today, more than 100,000 people are displaced to camps across northern Myanmar, and an estimated 13,500 people have been displaced by fighting this year. Many of these violations are continuing today, in particular in Kachin and Shan states, and as I'll explain, show similar patterns of military violations, involve the same perpetrators, and are characterized by the same patterns of impunity, which have only served to perpetuate cycles of abuse. For example, Amnesty International has identified 2 such units, the 33rd and the 99th Light Infantry Division, as being responsible for human rights violations. In Rakhine State, we have implicated them in massacres, rapes, and the burning of Rohingya villages from late August 2017, while in northern Myanmar, we have implicated them in war crimes. It is clear that deployment of these troops, known for their brutality and a track record of punishing ethnic minorities, collectively for their perceived support to an armed group, is linked to the commission of violations. The military also consistently failed to distinguish between armed groups and civilian populations, targeting innocent people for expediency and for their perceived affiliation to a particular group, often based on nothing more than their ethnic identity. Many of the patterns of abuse follow the military's 4-cut strategy, which has been in effect for decades and in which the Army cuts off insurgent groups and the support they receive. The most prevalent modern application of this its strategy is to cut off supplies by preventing humanitarian assistance to gain access and by burning farmland, tactics which are clearly seen conducted in Rakhine, Kachin, and Shan. However, the recent violence takes place in a wider context of institutional discrimination and segregation. Central to this is that most Rohingya have effectively been deprived of their citizenship and nationality as a result of discriminatory laws. This has had a cascade of negative impacts and has allowed the authorities to severely restrict their freedom of movement, segregating them from the rest of society. While Myanmar has undergone a series of political reforms, the reality is that these reforms have ensured that the military retains considerable power in the country. The military operates independently of civilian oversight, including civilian courts, which has effectively shielded members of the military from accountability. Investigations into allegations of human rights violations are rare, and most abuses have gone unpunished. It is clear that the Myanmar Authority cannot be trusted to adequately investigate the appalling crimes against the Rohingya or the Kachin and Shan. The military's tight structure and strict reporting requirements means that the responsibilities for these violations extends to the very top of the chain of command. So too must justice and accountability. To resolve this, I share a couple of following recommendations and agree with many of my colleagues. First is that the U.S. should support a UN Security Council referral of the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. Such referral should cover crimes across the country, including in Kachin and northern Shan. Second is that while building support for international justice, the international community should take immediate steps to ensure that evidence is collected and preserved for use in future judicial proceedings. The State Department is also, as my colleagues have mentioned, undergoing a similar process on the Rohingya, which should be made public and expanded to include Kachin and Shan violence. Third, the United States should push Myanmar to enact security sector reform and dismantle the system of discrimination and segregation built to exclude ethnic minorities. That security reform should include civilian oversight of the military and particularly in judicial proceedings. Fourth, and finally, a note on the legislation. We support both legislation that is making its way through Congress. We were heartened to see that the legislation passed the House on a 38-2 to 30 bipartisan vote, but Congress's failure to add it to the final NDA is a dark stain on its human rights record. Congress needs to speak with one voice and hold senior military officials accountable for their actions. The situation in Myanmar and the horrific abuses perpetrated by the security forces should shock the conscience. It is well past time for the international community, including the United States, to send a clear message to the Myanmar military that their atrocities will not go without consequences. Failure to change their behavior means we are likely to see further violations, abuses, and a continuing deterioration of the human rights situation in the country. Thank you.
Mr. Sullivan, welcome back.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern and Chairman Holtgren, and members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for holding this important hearing. The level of human rights abuses, forced displacement, and violations of international humanitarian law in Myanmar over the past year are nothing short of alarming. Disappearances, sexual violence, torture are regularly reported. Thousands have been newly displaced, while tens of thousands have been displaced for years. As one longtime humanitarian recently described to me, the feeling of despair and frustration is the strongest I've witnessed. Civilian areas, including near displaced camps, have been bombed indiscriminately, and none of this has anything to do with the Rohingya crisis. Everything I just mentioned is happening in Kachin and northern Shan states and has been happening for a long time. At the end of last year, Refugees International carried out a mission to a restricted area of Kachin state where tens of thousands of internally displaced persons have been displaced for 7 years now. In all, there are over 100,000 displaced persons in Kachin and northern Shan state. Almost half of those are in areas that are in non-government controlled areas, and they've been cut off from direct international aid since May of 2016. So after years of displacement, the people with whom Refugees International spoke cited growing difficulty in obtaining sufficient food, accessing medical care, and finding livelihood opportunities. Overall, there was a growing sense of desperation and frustration and increased fear of insecurity. As one local humanitarian worker told Refugees International, psychosocial support is increasingly needed as displaced persons continue to want to return to their homes but have been displaced for 7 years with little prospect for the future. In December of 2017, Refugees International concluded that the combination of reductions in international aid, waning attention, and most significantly, dramatically increased restrictions on assistance by the Myanmar government is creating a desperate and unsustainable situation for displaced persons in Kachin and northern Shan states. Sadly, in recent months, the situation has only deteriorated. Fighting in Kachin state displaced 5,000 people in April, and another 2,800 people have been newly displaced by fighting in Shan state in just the last 2 weeks. Humanitarian access is getting worse, not only for international groups into areas within government control, but also for local civil society into areas that are within the government-controlled areas. Earlier, I listed a series of human rights abuses that were taking place in Kachin and northern Shan state, and I said that they had nothing to do with the Rohingya crisis. Allow me to clarify that statement. For years, there have been these abuses happening in Kachin and northern Shan state, independent of what was happening in Rakhine state with the Rohingya. However, as some of my colleagues have pointed out, it is the same government, the same military that has been carrying these out, and in some cases, the very same soldiers. Particularly, as my colleague from Amnesty International pointed out, and as was covered by a recent Reuters investigative report, the 33rd and 99th Light Infantry Battalions spearheaded the response to the Rohingya, the ethnic cleansing that happened, and they have been deployed previously and are again deployed in Kachin and northern Shan state. Each of these elite battalions, and ultimately all Myanmar troops, answer to the head of Myanmar's army, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. A lack of accountability runs through the many abuses that have taken place across the country. Myanmar government and military investigations have resulted in little more than whitewashes, denying any responsibility for what amount to crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. This cycle of impunity must stop. The same is true for abuses committed by ethnic armed groups. Whoever is responsible for abuses must be held to account. There are several ways that human rights and humanitarian crisis in Kachin and northern Shan state can be addressed, and these can be found in greater detail in our report, which I would request to submit for the record. But for the purposes of this hearing, let me just highlight three. The U.S. Congress should, number one, press the government of Myanmar to lift restrictions on international aid and allow unfettered access for aid providers, human rights monitors, and media throughout the country. Number two, the U.S. Congress should sustain and augment humanitarian support to displaced persons in Kachin and northern Shan state through USAID funding of programs that support local civil society organizations. And number three, the U.S. Congress should take measures to curb abuses and ensure accountability for those responsible for serious human rights violations through targeted sanctions against senior military officials, support for a multilateral arms embargo, and support for a referral to the International Criminal Court. The U.S. Congress can support these measures by passing the Burma Act of 2018 and by urging the Trump administration to take action through targeted sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act. Congress can also urge the U.S. State Department to publicly release its investigation that is carrying out on abuses in Rakhine State and support the UN fact-finding mission's final report, which will be coming out in September. For the sake of those displaced, whether in Bangladesh or in isolated camps in northern Myanmar, the cycle of impunity must be ended, and accountability must be realized, and the prospects for a better future must be sought. Again, I thank you, and look forward to any questions you may have.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all. It's again, as I said to the previous panel, I mean, it is just awful what is happening, what continues to happen, and it's again, the challenge is actually trying to find ways that we can actually stop it. I mean, that will actually work in stopping what's going on. Let me begin just by asking a general question. You know, I've thought that clearly the situation has reached a point where this should be brought before the International Criminal Court. And, you know, I'm a little frustrated that we're not pushing the matter more. And I'd like to get your assessment of what you think this administration's efforts to kind of pursue that. I know that China may, you know, veto it, but, you know, God, we ought to put them on record at a minimum. Or maybe we ought to use some of our diplomatic skills to try to convince them that this is so horrific, you know, that they ought to not veto it. I mean, I think we're at the point now where, you know, that just seems like the logical step we ought to be taking. And, you know, I know you've been dealing with people in the administration, and I'm sure you've raised these issues, but I'd just be curious to get your kind of analysis of what you think we're doing, or whether or not this is seriously being considered, or is it just being dismissed because it might be a heavy lift? Mr. Ben Cosby?
So in my conversations with the administration, they point to the fact that, one, the United States isn't a signatory to the Rome Statute. Second,
We're not, but we constantly point to it.
of course, absolutely.
Yeah, right.
And we think that shouldn't stop the United States from doing a Security Council referral. It's also, but besides that, we haven't seen any sign that they've been pursuing through the United Nations any accountability mechanism. We haven't seen any sign of real conversations about International Criminal Court. Obviously, the U.S.-China relationship is very complex, but given the atrocities that are happening in Burma and are now being felt throughout the region, it should clearly rise to the level where we make this a priority with the Chinese, with the other members of the Security Council referral to bring these folks to justice and accountability.
Mr. Smith?
I would just add that China has multi-billion-dollar investments in Rakhine State, and regardless of whether those investments are held by China or other countries, genocide is bad for business no matter what. So apart from the moral imperative to ensure accountability for these abuses, there's also that component to it. But we would like to see creative, unprecedented leverage used at the Security Council level. We're not at all convinced that there's nothing that can be done, and we have seen not only from we've seen from diplomats from a number of countries on the Security Council this idea that the China veto is just is a given and cannot be nudged, and that's been leaned on to justify inaction. And so I think it's imperative right now for all of us to really press the administration to get creative to ensure that this happens. And also, too, just to add, the relationship between China and Myanmar has been complicated in the past. You know, as our Kachin colleagues noted, there's artillery landing on the China side of the border. China's not happy about that. There have been other decisions that have been made by Myanmar authorities in the past that have upset China. So that's a relationship that is also complicated. It's not set in stone. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if the American government believes in justice, I think we know for sure that there is absolutely no options nationally for justice for what has happened. Also that a regional court would probably not work in this situation. So what is the theory of change aside from the International Criminal Court? What other path is there? Also, I mean, I think the fact-finding mission, as Dan mentioned, the UN fact-finding mission will be an important moment, maybe to generate more interest in this as an option. And also the State Department's own research into the horrific abuses. Similar research was done into Darfur before the Republican administration at that time did refer the case together with the rest of the Security Council. So there's a clear precedent, and I don't see why this situation is anything except for equally, if not worse than that one.
Sullivan?
Yeah, and I agree. At the very least, you can force China to use that veto and create this sort of shame that can come from that. And there's a lot more that can be done diplomatically. If you think of the kind of things that are done around issues around North Korea or Iran, there's a lot more that the U.S. could do diplomatically. And then finally, I would just say it's significant to note that the prosecutor of the ICC is also looking at how the possibility of Bangladesh being able to refer the case to the ICC, because the crimes that started in Myanmar have continued, obviously, to Bangladesh.
Yeah, no, I just think we need to think creatively about how we can pressure the administration to pursue this issue. You know, I'll be very honest with you. On a whole range of human rights issues, it is the administration and I are at odds, and it's really frustrating because I think it reflects badly on the United States. But having said that, you know, hope springs eternal, and we can keep on pushing. And maybe perhaps one thing Congress can do is, you know, pass a resolution in support of urging the administration to pursue this with the UN Security Council about bringing this before the International Criminal Court. That may be something we can, you know, we should be thinking about. But I mean, ways to, you know, to make it clear that we're paying attention, and that, you know, we're just not. The idea that we just going to sit back and every once in a while issue a statement and throw our hands up in the air and say there's nothing we can do, I think we're beyond that point now. Ms. Wheeler, you know, are there best practices for documenting allegations of sexual violence, and are you confident that our administration is following those practices in its investigation of alleged crimes against the Rohingya?
Yes, there are best practices, and I don't know exactly what methodologies the State Department is using, but I'm extremely grateful that they are doing that. I think it's an incredibly important initiative, and I hope that it leads to real policy change, whatever it is that they find.
And just for the record, I think it's important to get on the record, I mean, is it clear to you from your research that the sexual violence committed by uniformed members of the security forces was a military policy, as opposed to individual bad apples amongst the military ranks?
Yes.
And do women victims come together across ethnic lines in search for justice and accountability? And what would constitute justice for the women that you've interviewed?
I think justice has many different levels. The women and girls that I spoke to did speak about justice. They did mention the ICC. They did talk about wanting to see an end to a lifetime of feeling repressed and as if at any moment something horrific could happen to them. There are also other things. Of the 52 women and girls that I spoke to, one of them knew what a condom was. One of them had received antenatal care, although almost all of them had been pregnant, mostly many times. All of them had given birth alone or with family members. So we're not just talking about sexual violence. We're talking about lifelong, like the most basic access to sexual and reproductive health care has been taken away. So, I mean, one form of reparation, and, you know, it's been incredibly important, the U.S. government and other governments providing generous amounts of aid to the Rohingya humanitarian response. So that's something that should continue. It's been disappointing to see that contributions have been much lower this time around than they were about a year ago. I think also something else that tends to happen is that victims are spoken to by investigators, like the State Department investigators, like us at this table, and then forgotten about for many years. And then perhaps in 10 years when we have an ICC case, hopefully, or another justice proceeding, you know, investigators go out again and try and find these women and persuade them to appear in court. What would be much better would be long-term support for survivors that begins now and then continues over many years, so that they're able to develop advocacy skills of their own. They're able to get access to the table, to politics, to power, so that they can speak their minds and talk about what has happened to them and advocate for what they want. That's what's really important and enabling for them.
I appreciate that. You know, Mr. Smith, you note that there were always local rights-based responses to mass atrocity crimes. Could you describe some of those responses in Kachin and Shane and Rakhine states? And are local actors sharing strategies or methodologies? Are there examples of inter-ethnic responses?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. There are always local responses to these situations. Right now, for example, there's a collective of Rohingya leaders that are coming together to determine for themselves what sort of advocacy strategies they want to work towards, determining objectives. Top among their list is a referral to the International Criminal Court. So there's definitely some there's some similarity there between the various groups. But beyond that, going back to 2017, following from the first wave of violence, there was a collection of 40 civil society organizations from all throughout the country, Kachin, Shan, Burman groups led by farmers, groups led by women, that called for an independent international investigation in Rakhine State. And it was this effort that helped in a big way to persuade the Human Rights Council to pass a resolution that created the fact-finding mission. So these types of things, while they don't always make headlines and they don't always they're not always heard about as much as other efforts, these efforts are taking place. In terms of situation in Kachin State, as we heard from our colleague earlier, the abuses there have been awful for a very long time, and there is a very active Kachin and Shan civil society network. There are organizations that have been documenting war crimes in Kachin and Shan State for many years, and at great personal risk. And these groups also are calling for an end to the impunity in Myanmar, and they're also calling for international justice and a referral to the International Criminal Court.
Thank you. Mr. Ben Cosme, in your testimony, you describe a series of actions taken by the Burmese military after the most acute violence against the Rohingya had ended in 2017, including the theft of livestock, burning and blocking access to markets, severely restricting humanitarian access, and remaking northern Rakhine State. I mean, are there steps the U.S. government should be taking in response to those kinds of atrocities? You know, are these kinds of actions also being taken in Kachin and Shane states?
Yeah, so the United States should definitely be raising at the highest levels for humanitarian access. It should be able to raise the fact that we need to dismantle this system of discrimination and segregation, which, as you've noted, have brought the Rohingya and other populations basically to the brink of starvation. We should also, when it comes, our most recent report documented the fact that some development that is going into Myanmar, and in particular to Rakhine State, is being used to bulldoze former Rohingya villages, that the Myanmar military, police guards, and local Rakhine State authorities are trying to change the demographics on the ground, basically trying to remake Rakhine State. There needs to be accountability with respect to international donors, with respect to where that money is going, making sure that there isn't any development projects that are only furthering to entrench the system of apartheid in Rakhine State. And we've seen those tactics, as you mentioned, the four-cut strategy, being employed in other places like Kachin and Shan. So whether it's cutting off of humanitarian assistance, whether it's limiting freedom of movement, all of those are really the same tactics in different scales being applied to the conflicts of other ethnic minorities, which demonstrate a clear, impunity towards ethnic minorities, regardless of where you are in the country, and is also oftentimes perpetuated by the same military units.
Mr. Sullivan, what will it take to restore livelihoods for the ethnic populations affected by years and years of conflicts? And do the demands for justice and accountability extend to the redress of the destruction of livelihoods?
Yes, as I mentioned, it's now been 7 years that some 100,000 people in Kachin and northern Shan State have been displaced, and the ability to find livelihood opportunities has been decreasing over that time, even as the needs have been increasing. So yes, that absolutely has to be a part of what is of the approach in the long term. You know, there's part of the broader national peace talks that are happening. Safe returns to people's homes or the areas where they come from needs to be a part of that. It's complicated by a lot of factors, including, as was talked about in the last panel, land confiscation, Chinese large banana plantation owners coming to take landmines that are in different areas. So it's going to be a long-term challenge, but it just underscores how that needs to be a part of any kind of national peace talks or reconciliation.
Yeah, we're running out of time here in terms of being able to have this room, but I wanted to just throw this out, and you could respond to it or not, and if there's anything you wanted to add that you didn't, now's the time to do it. But it just, I sometimes wonder why we are not responding more forcefully. I mean, I don't really get it. I mean, I was as frustrated as anybody with the language being dropped out of the NDA, a conference report. I mean, I was given some response about jurisdictional this and jurisdictional that, but it's like, I mean, it just doesn't seem to matter in the face of what is happening. You know, I asked the earlier panel about some of the feedback we get from some, including here in Congress, that if we push too hard, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi will be overthrown, and, you know, then others say if you know, that, you know, the military's content to have her there because she's, you know, puts, you know, a nice face on, you know, on giving them the ability to do some of the terrible things that they're doing. And I just think we're just so beyond that at this particular point, because the atrocities are so over the top and so horrific that, I mean, you know, that I think to be concerned about that at this particular point just doesn't, it's not a credible excuse to not react more forcefully. But I'm just, you know, I think, and the International Criminal Court thing is something I think we ought to aggressively pursue, and maybe we can do that through a resolution here in Congress to try to instruct the administration, because, you know, at this point, that's what, you know, we just need to step it up. But in any event, you could talk about that or anything else that you think ought to be part of the record by way of closing. So I'll open this up to whoever wants to. All of you want to speak, but I mean, whoever wants to go first can go. Yeah.
I'll just say thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today, and I agree with your remarks, and I would just add that efforts toward an ICC referral in and of itself could have a preventative effect. I think the generals in Myanmar should be concerned about the prospects of international justice, and that should weigh on them before they order the next round of mass killings or before they oversee mass atrocities that are continuing. With regard to U.S. policy thus far, we were recently traveling with a delegation led by Kerry Kennedy from Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, and that delegation was told by a senior U.S. diplomat that U.S. policy with regard to the Rohingya crisis, and he said this approvingly, was quote-unquote small ball. And if that is the deliberate approach to what amounts to genocide, it's very concerning, obviously, and we would like to see whatever this small ball approach is, we would like to see that scrapped.
Right.
But thank you again for your attention and your focus on these issues. We appreciate
And look, I'm the author of the Magnitsky Act. I'm the co-author of the Global Magnitsky Act. I mean, they ought to use it. It's not like there's not evidence there as to put more people on that list. I mean, but they ought to be aggressively adding people to that list. And I don't, for the life of me, understand what's taking so damn long. But in any event, I mean, it's an issue we keep on pushing this administration on. Not only, I'll be honest with you, not just with regard to Burma, but with regard to a whole bunch of other countries. You know, and the beauty of the Magnitsky Act is that you can target your sanctions, you know, against the individuals. But in any event, who wants it? Mr. Cosme?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, again for hosting this very important hearing. We very much share your frustration, both with the U.S. policy and what the international community has been unable to do. I think it's important to note that the European Union imposed sanctions on 7 senior military officials, and the sky did not fall.
Right.
It's important to note that after the U.S. imposed sanction on Maung Maung So, he was then subsequently basically made to disappear, was reshuffled and since retired. So while there's not enough pressure, some types of pressure do work, and it's important to continue that pressure. We've clearly seen a shift in communication strategy from the Myanmar government, whether it's through the recent Memorandum of Understanding with the UNHCR and UNDP. But I think it still remains an open question as to whether that repatriation deal will be actually safe, voluntary, and dignified for the Rohingya people. They've also announced sort of the Rakhine, sort of a commission to investigate many of these atrocities. But I think it's also important to note, and from Amnesty's point of view, we have serious concerns that there would be any protection of witnesses and that there's actual culture for witnesses to come forth and provide evidence for that investigative body, whether it's because of instances like the Burmese Reuters journalists who were imprisoned for trying to uncover these abuses, whether it's the police officer who flipped and tried to showcase, that they were trying to set up the Reuters journalist who also was detained, or whether it's the child soldier who tried to come forth and criticize the military, clearly shows a system of impunity within the military, that the lack of accountability and
Right.
civilian oversight make it really impossible for any credible, independent, and impartial investigative body within Myanmar.
Sullivan?
So I'll try to end on a little bit of a note of hope. I think obviously there's a lot more that the administration can do and has in its power now to act. But I do think there are some within the administration who do care about this and are trying to do more. And I think that we're in a time period where there's growing momentum towards action. Between the reports that have been discussed on this panel, the State Department report, and the fact-finding mission report coming up, I think there'll be a lot more pressure. And I also note that the administration is holding this religious ministerial
Right.
where they have highlighted Rohingya, and they have so I think and Ambassador Brownback has traveled to the region and covered this. So I think there is some cause for cautious optimism that more will be done as this momentum goes forward, and I think that Congress also has a role to play to make sure that these moments don't get lost.
Wheeler?
I think my colleagues have made a lot of really good points. I mean, you ask why, and I think it's because when people are treated really, really badly for a very, very long time, it becomes very easy to continue to ignore them and treat them badly. I've seen this all over the world, but never actually in such a astonishingly awful way as in the case of the Rohingya crisis. But yeah, I mean, I think we also know what needs to happen, and we know what needs to be done. It's just a matter of getting there and doing it.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think sometimes, because the atrocities are so massive, and we when we get the reports and the numbers of people displaced, the numbers of people murdered, the numbers of people raped, I mean, the numbers are just startling. But I think sometimes we're so overwhelmed with the numbers that we lose our human ability to feel what's going on here, or because the crisis has been going on for so long, we just kind of like, well, that's just the way it is, and we have to resist that because people are, I think people are suffering, and people are counting on the civilized world to care. And I'll just end with that. I remember I tried to go to Sudan several years ago, and they wouldn't give me a visa. Couldn't get one in Washington. Someone said you can get one in Ethiopia. Tried in Ethiopia. They wouldn't give me one in Ethiopia. They said go to Kenya. You get one. Well, I couldn't go, so I went to Chad and went to the border, and went to a refugee camp where the International Criminal Court was interviewing Sudanese victims to build a case against President Bashir. And I remember this young mother in this tent, sweltering heat, in this refugee camp, talking about what happened to her entire family, basically murdered, and she witnessed it. And I just couldn't, I was amazed that she was able to get through her testimony. When it was all over with, I was introduced to her, and I didn't really know what to say. I said, thank you for sharing that. I think it's important. And her response was, if I didn't think people cared, then I would have no reason to want to live, because I've lost everything. My children and my husband and everybody I care about in the world. And I keep on thinking of that. I keep on thinking of that moment. Not only with regard to what's happening in Burma, but with so many other places in the world. I mean, people are counting on us to care, and if we don't, then who will, right? and on this case, we ought to be doing everything humanly possible to try to put pressure on this government to stop it. I'm not saying, who knows whether going to the International Criminal Court would actually stop it. We don't know, but at least we ought to try everything. And so I appreciate your testimony, the previous panel as well, and I look forward to working with you in the weeks and months ahead as we try to figure out how we in Congress can do more and be more effective. Thank you very much. The hearing has come to an end.